Revolution Radio proudly presents, live from the heart of the Blue Ridge, Roanoke, Virginia. It's the Just Bernard Show with host Bernard Alvarez. Join Bernard as he shares topics that reveal the real matrix and empower your human experience, including world liberty, the esoteric, suppressed technologies, spiritual ascension, and human consciousness. Humanity has awakened, and our time has come to realize our full potential. And now, live from the Star City, your host, Bernard Alvarez.
Let's get into our discussion here. Let me tell you a little bit about Paul Burley. We're very happy to welcome Paul Burley to the show. He is a researcher of ancient and indigenous symbolism. His experience includes almost 30 years as a registered engineer and environmental geologist. His book, The Sacred Sphere, Exploring Sacred Concepts and Cosmic Consciousness Through Universal Symbolism, sheds new light on the paradigm of ancient and indigenous sacred symbolism and the universal nature of spherical geometry. Paul was on the show, a couple of years back, and we spoke about that. You guys really love that show. His latest book, Stonehenge As Above, So Below, New Generation Publications, is publishing that. This book is a game changer. The book identifies the original design and purpose of the Stonehenge Ritual Landscape, and is changing our understanding of the people who built Stonehenge. So without further ado, thank you so much for joining us today, Paul Burley. Welcome.
Thank you, Bernard. It's wonderful to talk to you again. And since writing the Sacred Sphere, I've had a lot of comments about the geometry that I talk about there and how it applies to these many cultures throughout time. And this book on Stonehenge is just one of those examples. But the more I delve into Stonehenge and why it was built in the first place, I couldn't believe what I was uncovering, and so it should be an interesting show. I'm looking forward to talk to you about it.
Wonderful, and thank you. With that being said, Paul, and I always like to get the conversation going by speaking and asking you a little bit about what was it that drew you to this type of study? How did you come to study ancient and indigenous symbolism, such as Stonehenge?
Well, it started with discovering this Native American medicine wheel in the mountains of Wyoming back in 2003, and of course this was a round circular structure of stones, and it had a number of radiuses coming out from the center of the circle out to the edge, and this cairn of stones in the middle, and that got me going, looking at what was the purpose of these circular sacred structures. They're essentially symbols representing something, and so I spent almost 600 pages in the Sacred Sphere describing what the purpose was of these circular structures from many cultures, ancient and indigenous cultures. And I was fascinated by that, first realizing what this one Native American medicine wheel was intended to represent for the Lakota Nation, and that took me on to looking at cultures around the world throughout time, and thus the book, The Sacred Sphere. But by 2013, I thought it would be good to take a look at a concrete example, some structure, some architecture, some symbolism, ancient symbolism that many people around the world would have some familiarity with. And I thought about different cultures and structures that would be a great example of what I discuss in the Sacred Sphere, something concrete people would be familiar with. And Stonehenge came to mind. So the connection really starts with the fundamental geometry of Stonehenge, consisting of a circular architecture, this henge of the ditch and the bank in a circular form. That a henge is nothing more than a circular ditch and bank, and and of course, there are the megaliths that are within it that form additional circles, concentric circles about within that ditch. So it's basically circular symbolism, and architecture is nothing but symbolism. So I decided to use Stonehenge as an example of this circular symbolism that I discuss in detail in the Sacred Sphere. That's what got me going looking at Stonehenge. But within days, certainly within a week of starting to look at Stonehenge and describe for myself what that symbolism was all about as a sacred circular structure, I started to discover much more detail. It became very apparent to me what Stonehenge was all about, more than just the sacred circular symbolism representing a spherical geometry. There's much more to that structure itself, and as it turns out, the landscape around it for many miles around it. And it forms a very cohesive story of what these people 5,500 years ago were intending to construct on Salisbury Plain at Stonehenge, around Stonehenge, and indeed across the British Isles. And I was just floored by what I was discovering. But I'm absolutely sure of what I talk about in Stonehenge as above, so below as being very factual. This isn't a creation in my mind of what these people were doing, but it's very well founded on hard archaeological evidence as well as astronomy, architecture, engineering, surveying, a very holistic approach to trying to understand Stonehenge and what the intent was for that structure. So it's very well founded in science, very well founded in a variety of sciences and engineering disciplines, and I'm very happy to bring that to the fold because it's going to change our understanding of Stonehenge and Neolithic Britain, and should change the way that the archaeologists are studying Stonehenge and other Neolithic sites in Britain.
I bet it is, and I'm sure your work is absolutely wonderful and your research on this matter. But before we delve into Stonehenge itself, I wanted to ask you, Paul, um, the sphere, the sacred sphere, the circle. You have studied so many of these sites, so many of these, whether they be megaliths or whether they be sacred circles and sacred areas around the world. Have you found a common, um, I guess, common belief or common definition or common symbolism of what this image meant to the people that created them?
Yeah, the common theme for virtually all circular symbols that are representing sacred relationships. It's common to all religions and sacred life ways, and one of the most common ones that people in the Americas would be familiar with is the medicine wheel, and Native American medicine wheels. But mandalas and many other circular architectures and symbols that you find in religions around the world, they all have something very common in place. And it's not just the geometry, but the geometry is expressing some very important concepts. And they are related to sacred relationships between people and the earth, people and the cosmos, and people and the creator, whoever this creator was that created this magnificent universe. In fact, that creator may be the universe itself. Um, uh, each culture had different ways of envisioning who this creator was, and how they were able to make manifest this wonderful universe that we live in. But these are the four sacred relationships between human beings, the earth, the cosmos, and the creator, that all of these circular symbols are attempting to relate to us through that geometrical symbolism. And it's not a two-dimensional structure. That circle is two-dimensional only in that it's an easy way on a planar feature, whether it's on a piece of paper or on the ground surface of the earth. It's an easy way to represent a sphere by drawing a circle. And the pyramids in Egypt on the Giza Plateau, those pyramids are designed very specifically, geometrically, and ultimately then mathematically to be representing a hemisphere,
Mhm.
half of a sphere. But the intent of that architecture, again, architecture being nothing more than symbolism, that symbolism is representing the spherical form. And that form then as a sphere indicates directions, frontward, backward, to the sides, and up and down. So six primary directions, the seventh direction being inward, of course, whether that's inward to the center of the earth, center of the universe, center of our galaxy, center of the human being, the heart or the mind, and then the universe splaying out in all directions, but the six primary directions oftentimes are referred to in the geometry. So that is what the sacred sphere, the sacred circle is representing, these ideas of from the center within everything else is encountered, and that human being, the human condition being at the center oftentimes. And again, that's what Stonehenge then is, a circular structure representing a sphere. It is representing these very same things. And oftentimes that sphere in a greater context is representing the womb, the center of life, the center of the universe that creates the life that is exhibited throughout it, and certainly which we find on the earth. So there's the womb symbolism is very important in all of these circular symbolisms as well.
And you just answered my next question. Did you find that at Stonehenge? So thank you for that. Um, as far as what you've discovered, and you said you've made some very scientific theories and have found new discoveries, for lack of a better term. What are some of the conflicting, I guess, empirical beliefs about Stonehenge that you found perhaps were not true in your findings?
Well, there are a number of theories. I would go so far as to say that they're not even theories on the part of the archaeological community and other scientific community and non-scientific community as to what Stonehenge represents, why it was constructed, what its purpose was, and so forth. And it's very dismaying to me that these theories and hypotheses get thrown out to the media, because we all rely on newspaper and the internet to be providing good, accurate information that we can utilize in our lives. And when inaccurate information is thrown out there that is presented as if it should be believable, as if it is accurate, it's scientifically based, when in fact it isn't, that's very disheartening. I think for anyone that really wants to get to the bottom of understanding ancient cultures, indigenous cultures, and answering the basic questions of who are we, why are we here, what is our purpose, and why are we here now? Yourself and myself, why are we living in this universe for a few decades, and what's our real purpose here? And so we want to know the real good, accurate answers to those questions. And when we're thrown out falsehoods and it's supposed to be believing them, and those falsehoods are based on inaccurate or insufficient evidence, to me it's very disheartening. So
Yeah.
a number of those issues come into play regarding Stonehenge. Uh, One of them is that Stonehenge is all about stone alignments, and that Stonehenge basically is all about alignments between the stones and the sun, and that people were worshiping the sun, therefore, and that it has been found that certain features related to erosion of the soil and the underlying bedrock there have a certain orientation to them, such that it's thought that the reason why the avenue which extends out from Stonehenge and over to the River Avon, if people are familiar with the structure that's called referred to as the avenue, that the avenue and the orientation of Stonehenge toward the midsummer solstice the reason why those orientations were important to the people that built Stonehenge is because these glacial features in the soils have the same orientation. Well, there's no evidence at all to connect the two. We have natural features in the soil and bedrock that are oriented in the same direction as where the sun rises at summer solstice at Stonehenge. But one simply can't conclude then that these features are the reason why this orientation towards the summer solstice was important. There's just it's improper for the scientific community to be drawing these types of conclusions, getting it out into the media, and the media feeding us this information, and there's really no scientific basis for it. And yet we're supposed to conclude that well, the reason why they built Stonehenge and have this alignment towards summer solstice is because the ground surface is oriented in that direction. It's a completely bogus assertions here. So that's one important one, because the alignment of the avenue between Stonehenge and the River Avon is a very important feature of the landscape, and it's important to understand exactly why it was constructed in the configuration that it is. And that's something that we can get into. It's a very important part of the landscape. So, but there are many ideas that are thrown out there by the archaeological community that are just plain false or not supported by the data. And another important one then concerns the largest monument out on the Stonehenge landscape, and that is something called the Stonehenge Cursus. The Cursus is, again, it's defined on the outside by a bank and a ditch that extends about 1.7 miles long, about 10,000 feet long, and it's about a football field wide. It's a very huge.
Wow.
Very few people are aware of it. And because it's a linear feature and it's within about a half mile of Stonehenge, the archaeologists conclude, for lack of any real hard evidence, that this must have been a roadway that people were carrying their dead family along, and at some point, they process along this Cursus, and at some point they turn and walk over to Stonehenge, run rituals, and then they bury the dead. And that's the end of the story on the Cursus, that it's some sort of procession way. There's no evidence at all that it was ever used as a procession way. None. Yet if you research the Cursus and try to find out what the archaeological community says about it, the assumption is that it must be a procession way. And again, there's no evidence for it. But in my book, I show very specifically what all of the evidence points to as to what the purpose of the Cursus was, and it's a very important feature. The whole built environment concerning Stonehenge and the surrounding landscape very much centers on that Cursus, and it's very important to understand specifically what it really was intended to be built for 1,000 years before Stonehenge was even placed on the ground.
And I'm so glad you brought that up, because I know of the surrounding landscape a bit, and it seems that there's so much focus on the Stonehenge structure, that many people throw aside the importance of what is going on around Stonehenge and what it was, like you said, even prior to the building of the megalithic structure. Could you perhaps describe for us what this entire area was? What could we see when we're not looking at Stonehenge, and what was the importance of perhaps putting Stonehenge there when they did?
Sure. Well, it's pretty well established by the archaeological community that Stonehenge, the megalithic structure with the large stones placed in circles, and the henge itself, were built between about 2500 BC to 3000 BC. 1,000 years before that, back to about 3500 BC, is when the first monuments are being constructed in and around the Stonehenge area. And it looks like the first of those monuments was the Cursus that I was just referring to, about 1.7 miles long. It is a huge structure, and it is located just north of Stonehenge. And shortly after construction of the Cursus, or while it was being constructed, the people started constructing long barrows, and people may be familiar with circular burial barrows, round barrows within which bodies or bones have been deposited. You find that in the native North America and many other locations around the world. Uh, and there are many round barrows on the Stonehenge landscape, but those are Bronze Age. They come after megalithic Stonehenge was constructed. The first barrows that were constructed are long barrows. They are long features. They're linear features, and again, in many of them, but not all of them, there were bodies or bones that were buried inside them. Well, when the Cursus was constructed and these long barrows were being built in about 3500 BC, it turns out an archaeologist discovered about 20 years ago, his name is Terence Meaden, discovered that these long barrows are oriented with their primary direction oriented towards one end of the Cursus or the other end 1.7 miles away. So there is a geometrical relationship between where these long barrows are located and their orientation pointing to one end of the Cursus or the other. And archaeologists started looking at that and saying, well, there must be an alignment from the long barrow to the end of the Cursus out to the horizon. There must be a star rising or setting, or the moon or the sun is rising, and that's the reason for these alignments. But what they found was there was no consistent relationship between these barrows and the Cursus and stars rising and setting. There was nothing that made any sense. And I agree that doesn't make sense, because as it turns out, what was being laid out in 3500 BC with respect to the Cursus and these long barrows is a very large engineered, designed, and surveyed onto the ground structure. And that structure is not related to alignments towards certain stars or the sun. What they were constructing was a feature in the sky above the horizon. And this structure is what we call today the winter hexagon or the winter oval. And it is a set of 6 stars, therefore the hexagon. And this hexagon extends from the star Sirius, which is the brightest star in the sky, along the Milky Way up to the star Capella.
Hold that thought, Paul. We're coming up on a break. Please remember where you were.
And now, back to your host, Bernard Alvarez.
And welcome back to the show. You're listening to the Just Bernard Show here on Revolution Radio, freedomslips.com. I am Bernard Alvarez, and we are speaking with researcher and author Paul Burley. And before the break, Paul, you were talking about the winter hexagon star formation and the connection to Sirius, which I'm sure many people are very interested in. Can you pick up where you left off, sort of?
Yeah, I won't get into the details. Much of that is in the book, and I hope people will take a look at that, because it has direct relationships with what I'm talking about with many other cultures around the world, including the Egyptians, who were looking at the same part of the sky and realized some important implications of this, and these same implications seem to be exhibited in Britain at the same time in about 3500 BC. What these people at Stonehenge laid out was the winter hexagon extending the length of the greater Stonehenge Cursus from the west end of the Cursus through to the east end of the Cursus and beyond, up to where another very well-known monument is located, and that monument is Woodhenge. And so they laid out this winter hexagon, and as it turns out, the Cursus is representing the Milky Way extending from the star Sirius up to the star Capella. And that's generally in an east-west direction. It's not due east-west, and the Cursus has been reported to be oriented towards the vernal equinox, so due east-west. It's not. It's oriented 6 degrees north of being due east, so it's slightly pointing to the northeast, and that's very important. So they constructed this stellar feature, which you see up in the sky, not on the horizon. And this time of year is a great time of year to see that, because in the evening, once it's dark out, if everyone looks up and to the east, you will see the winter hexagon. You'll see Sirius, you look up high, and you'll see the star Capella. And within that hexagon area is the constellation of Orion. And Orion is very important, and people probably realize the importance of Orion in the Egyptian culture as
Yeah.
representing this god Osiris. Well, uh, so we have these important features of the winter hexagon, the the Milky Way, the ecliptic of the sun passes right through the middle of this hexagon, and you have Orion. And so this is what these people at Stonehenge were laying out on the ground surface. Now the question is, why would they do that? And the answer comes from studying many other sites across Britain, as well as looking at other contemporary Neolithic cultures. These are Stone Age cultures. Remember, we're not they're not, they don't have bronze. They're not using copper. Everything is constructed with stone tools at the time, and yet they have this very great interest in this part of the sky at the winter hexagon. Well, so do the Egyptians, so do the Chinese, so do the Mayans, so do native North Americans and Central Americans and South Americans. This part of the sky for many of these cultures, Neolithic cultures throughout time, was in this recognition, belief, or knowledge that the source of life in the cosmos comes from within the winter hexagon, and that Orion is it represents that entity in the cosmos that protects the spirit and sends the spirit forth to Earth to join with the material of Mother Earth to create life on Earth. And that when the body dies and the body is returned to the Earth, the spirit returns back to the cosmos, back to Orion within this winter hexagon. The winter hexagon representing the womb of the cosmos. Okay, so this was a worldwide belief by Neolithic cultures for a very long period of time. And this is what was laid out on the ground surface around Stonehenge, and it's very, very plain. And this is exhibited very plainly by the greater Cursus, because again, it's not oriented due east-west. It's slightly turned towards it's a straight feature oriented towards just slightly north of being due east. And so the idea was ultimately that the body of the dead is brought to Stonehenge, and the body there are rituals performed, the body is returned to Mother Earth. The question is, what happens to the spirit? Stonehenge isn't all about the dead, as the archaeologists suggest. It's all about life. And so what these people did is they built the Cursus such that the spirit going to the west end of the Cursus looks towards the east end of the Cursus, sees the winter hexagon rise, and again, the hexagon is the home for the spirit, that cosmic home, the cosmic womb. When it saw that winter hexagon rise, it knew it now had that roadway back up to the stars, back to where it came from. So this Cursus is really representing the road of the dead, the pathway for the spirit, the stairway to heaven. It's Jacob's ladder, as it's described in the Bible. This is the pathway back to the stars for the spirit to return where it came from, back to Orion, who is that protector of the spirit. That's why this is very important from a spiritual standpoint, because now we can connect the same mythology, the same cosmology, the same sacred concepts that have been realized worldwide in many cultures, ancient and indigenous cultures. In fact, the same beliefs, the same knowledge, the same architecture was being built in Britain to represent these very same ideas of connecting us to the cosmos, connecting the earth to the cosmos, connecting us to the creator of the universe and the source of spirit that I'm discussing in the sacred sphere. Suddenly, what I was finding at Stonehenge and the surrounding landscape is these very same concepts were being laid out over 8 square miles not just in spherical or round form, but as a map of the stars and a connection for us through that map back to the stars and back to our source, our cosmic source in the sky.
Wow. So this, the what you have just explained, it certainly changes my outlook on what the use of Stonehenge was. And if I get this right, what you're saying to me is that not only the megalithic structure was important, the entire representation of the area surrounding Stonehenge was utilized in this return to source type burial ritual that you're talking about. Is that
Yeah,
right?
that's right. The greater context, Stonehenge is a monument, and it's a very famous one because of the large megaliths, the very large
Right.
sculptures. But there are many, many monuments or in that area within a few miles of Stonehenge, and they are just as important. It just so happens they don't have all of the megaliths associated with them, so we don't really think about them as much as Stonehenge itself. But Stonehenge, in the greater context, on the ground surface, in amongst these other monuments, is placed relative to these other star locations and the Cursus representing the Milky Way and so forth. Stonehenge itself is situated in the landscape to represent the belt stars of Orion.
Right.
So it is right to that source of spirit, that cosmic spirit represented by Orion. That is, in the greater context, is what Stonehenge is representing. And of course, that's very fundamental. That's very important. It plays a very important role in that landscape and describing the story that these people are sending to us, after 5,500
Right.
years. Now, there's another context that comes into play, and that's within this greater context of the winter hexagon and Orion and so forth. If we just look at Stonehenge itself, then what I discovered is that Stonehenge, although in the greater context it's representing the belt stars of Orion, for Stonehenge itself, that as a circular structure representing a sphere, representing the womb now of the earth and the source of life on earth, now you can see this correct understanding that we've had for some time, that there's a connection between Stonehenge and the sun rising at summer solstice, and this idea that the sun's energy, the cosmic energy at dawn on summer solstice, shines down into Stonehenge, which is this womb for the creation of life on Earth. So at summer solstice, essentially, you have an event occurring, which is the conception of new life for the coming year. People have generally had an understanding of that, but it's been kind of nebulous. But now there's good reason to believe that that is the correct understanding of Stonehenge within this greater context, again, of the winter hexagon as the womb of the cosmos. Now we look at Stonehenge as the womb of the earth, and it also has the interaction with the cosmos through the sun to actually create and combine the spirit of the cosmos with the material of the earth to create life within the womb of earth represented by Stonehenge itself. So that's the smaller, more intimate context of Stonehenge, which we've generally had some understanding of. People kind of appreciate that with respect to the summer solstice sunrise and so forth. But now it becomes very concrete. That's a very accurate understanding of what Stonehenge itself is all about.
Wow. It seems like this massive alchemical experiment that they did beautifully.
Yeah, and the interesting thing then is this avenue that I referred to, which is a roadway that was built from Stonehenge to the east, northeast. It has kind of a strange pathway to it, and it bends down in a couple times and goes for a couple of miles, and ultimately reaches the banks of the River Avon to the east. And it's got a very curious form to it, and no one's realized why it has this path that it takes. It's thought that it's been the easiest path between the river and getting up to Stonehenge, but actually, it is it is built in a form, in a certain pathway across the landscape as to represent the arm of Orion
Oh, wow.
very accurately. So again, to the north we have the Milky Way represented by the the greater Cursus, and we have at Stonehenge representing Orion. Well, the avenue itself, this path from the river up to Stonehenge, is representing that arm of Orion, so that the archaeologists say that the body of the dead was brought down the river Avon, and then they brought the body from the boat onto the bank and walked that body in procession along the avenue to Stonehenge and ran their ceremonies. I think that's correct because the avenue is representing that arm of Orion. And what does that symbolize? That's bringing the dead in body and spirit along that pathway to the arm of Orion so that Orion can now receive that life back. So
Wow.
symbolically on Earth, you are returning that life back to where it came from. Along that pathway, you get to Stonehenge, you run your rituals, you bury the body, you return it back to Earth where it came from, and they have created the greater Cursus as that pathway back to the stars, the stairway to heaven, so the spirit can also return back to where it came from. That's a magnificent story, and it
Yeah.
is not about the dead. It is all about eternal life and what happens to us when our body gives out on us. Where do we go? What do we do? Well, these people believe that we returned back to the stars, to the winter hexagon, back to Orion. And that is very similar to what the Egyptians believed at the very same time.
Yes.
Very similar to what many cultures around the world have
I,
believed.
I was going to say that, Paul. It very much aligns with what we hear from many of the Native American, especially the Southwestern, and in doing so, there is a common belief from many of these indigenous cultures, ancient indigenous cultures, that Sirius has a very big role in that, and that the sky people came from Sirius and gave us life in many of the mythologies. Does that align with what you're seeing at Stonehenge?
It actually does because when today you can go to Stonehenge, go to the west end of the Cursus, stand there and face eastward towards the east end of the Cursus. And if you let the at nighttime, early evening, this time of the year, and you watched Capella rise to the east, and you see Orion rising as well. As Capella rises, the question is, where is the star Sirius? Sirius would plot, the direction would be underneath your feet, underneath the ground. And so I think the idea here is that with us coming from Sirius or going to Sirius, essentially, symbolically, Sirius is now underneath the ground, below us.
Oh, wow.
And so when we step off and walk along the Cursus up to Capella and up to Orion, essentially, uh, Earth and Sirius are at the same point. They're below us. We're standing on Earth. We're standing above Sirius. And we take that step then along the Cursus from Sirius up towards Capella. And this may be the origination of this idea that we came from Sirius, because the beginning point along the Milky Way to get back to that source in the winter hexagon is at the star Sirius, which essentially we're standing upon when we look to the east and see Capella to the east. I think that may help to explain why the thought that Sirius is the source, because that's where it's located underneath us, standing there. So it does come into play. It's very important, as you say, for many of these cultures, and it's very evident that Stonehenge and its environment have Sirius playing a very important role in all of this.
Paul, I have a question about, well, the people who live there, who created Stonehenge. Now, is there? They aren't the Celts. They aren't the Druids. They were Neolithic people, but in reference to perhaps the Druids and the Celts, did they take over the site? How did that come about? Or were there any relation to the Neolithic tribes that were there? What do you know about this?
Well, the Cursus and these long barrows, the first monuments to be constructed on that Stonehenge landscape, that occurs in about 3500 BC. 1,000 years later, megalithic Stonehenge is constructed. Okay, so this is all during the Stone Age, the Middle to Late Stone Age. 1,000 years after Stonehenge is built, the Celts arrive, and this is a migration that occurs from Eastern Europe across Europe and ultimately reaches Britain. And in about 1500 BC, Stonehenge is built 2500 BC. So it's 1,000 years later that the Celts arrive. And I apologize. There's a phone on in the office here. Um, the Celts arrive 1,000 years after Stonehenge is built, and I think that there is an evolution of thought and understanding that the Celts adapt and adopt to what the indigenous understanding was by the people that built Stonehenge, and they add that knowledge to their own, and there's a creation of a new understanding, new beliefs, that it's essentially an evolution of thought that's going on. So the Celts bring forward that ancient knowledge and apply it in their own way to Stonehenge and their own rituals and beliefs. But Stonehenge didn't originate with the Celts. The Celts learn of it 1,000 years after it's built and incorporate their understandings into it, and probably utilize Stonehenge in some fashion, but they come well after Stonehenge was built. So it's incorrect to be tying the original purpose for construction of Stonehenge and its landscape directly to the Celts. The Celts just happened to come across Stonehenge in the migrations 1,000 years later, and then incorporate it and make use of it in some fashion.
Absolutely. Wow. Very, very fascinating. And with that being said, what about the title? Why did you choose the subtitle, As Above, So Below?
Well, certainly what we're finding on the ground at Stonehenge and across its landscape is directly tied. The architecture of what was laid out on the ground surface across 8 square miles of Salisbury Plain, the architecture, this symbolism that was laid out on the ground surface, is directly related to essentially the architecture of what we see in the cosmos, of this perceived hexagon, this winter hexagon that we see extending along a part of the Milky Way and crossed by the ecliptic, the path of the sun. And the architecture of a certain number of stars that we call the constellation of Orion. All of these perceived persons, gods, these different constellations are perceived to represent certain things in the human mind and the human experience. And we relate our own experience to what we see in the stars. And so they're seeing these relationships in the stars and representing certain sacred relationships. And it was so important to them. These relationships were so important to them, and they needed to make a connection between the earth and themselves to the cosmos and these gods in the sky, that they recreated what they saw in the sky onto the ground surface. So as you have the womb of the cosmos above, so you have the womb of the earth below, constructed on the ground surface. As you have Orion as the protector of spirit in the cosmos within that winter hexagon, so below on the ground surface you have Stonehenge, representing the belt stars of Orion, representing that womb of the earth, representing that protector of life on earth. A very direct, as above, as we see in the cosmos, so below, down on earth relationship is what we have at Stonehenge. And Stonehenge isn't the only place that we find these relationships. We find them in many sacred landscapes across the earth, in China, in Central America, in South America. Many places there were very large landscapes built to represent these very same ideas.
Absolutely wonderful and absolutely fascinating. And I thank you so much for bringing this information forward. Believe it or not, Paul, we are out of time. This went by very quickly. Thank you for being here and sharing this information. Before we go, Can you tell us more about where we can find more information about what you're doing, your books, and everything that you've discovered at Stonehenge?
Sure. Yeah. If people are interested in learning more about the book and myself, they can go to my website. That's as above, so below, -pauldburley.com. The book's available on Amazon and many other bookstore websites, but they can go to amazon.com or amazon.co.uk and so forth and look at the book and read about that, as well as the book, The Sacred Sphere. I also have Facebook pages at Paul D. Burley or Stonehenge As Above, So Below. People can look for those Facebook pages and like those pages, and I'm posting all the time new information.
That's great. Well, thank you so much, Paul, and thank you everyone for listening. We will see you next week with my special guest, Kathy Bilski will be joining us for the hour. We love you